My name is Evelyn Marie Thompson, and I was 72 when my world started to crack. For 40 years I'd lived in my two-story house on Elm Street in Maplewood, a small town where everyone knew your name and your business. That house wasn't just brick and mortar, it was my anchor. I'd raised my son Daniel in its creaky rooms, filled with the smell of fresh-baked cookies and the sound of his laughter. The oak tree in the backyard still held the tire swing he'd begged for at 6, its ropes frayed but stubborn, like me. After my husband George passed 10 years ago from a heart attack, that house became my proof I could stand on my own. I'd worked as a librarian for 30 years, shelving books and helping kids with their homework, all while pinching pennies to pay the mortgage and keep the lights on. I'd earned every inch of that place, and no one was going to take it from me, or so I thought. It started with a dinner, one I'd cooked with care like always. I'd spent the afternoon roasting a chicken, mashing potatoes, and steaming green beans from my garden. The oak dining table, bought at a flea market in '82 when George and I were young and broke, was set with my good plates, the ones with the blue floral pattern. Daniel, now 38, and his wife Claire sat across from me. Daniel had his father's dark hair, though it was thinning now, and his eyes darted around like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Claire, with her sharp cheekbones and sharper tongue, wore a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She'd always had a way of making me feel small, with her comments about my quaint kitchen or my vintage furniture, but I'd brushed it off for Daniel's sake. He loved her and I loved him, so I tried. Halfway through dinner, Claire pushed a stack of papers across the table, her manicured nails glinting under the chandelier. "Just sign here, Evelyn," she said, her voice sweet as honey, but with an edge that made my skin prickle. "It's nothing important, just some estate planning stuff. For the family." Her lips curled into a smirk, a flicker of triumph in her hazel eyes, like she'd already won a game I didn't know we were playing. Daniel wouldn't meet my gaze, his fork scraping his plate as he stirred his potatoes into a mushy pile. My stomach twisted, not from the food, but from the sudden weight of their silence. Something was wrong. I'm not naive. I'd seen Claire's type before, calculating, always angling for more. She'd redecorated their condo with marble countertops and chandeliers, posting pictures on that Instagram thing, while rolling her eyes at my linoleum floors. But Daniel, my boy, who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms, clutching his stuffed bear, was letting her lead. He'd always been soft-hearted, easily swayed, but I never thought he'd turn that softness against me. I reached for the papers, my fingers brushing the crisp edges, and said, "I'll look them over." My voice was calm, but inside, my heart was pounding. Claire's smirk faltered, just for a second, and her eyes narrowed. "Oh, take your time," she said, but her tone was tighter now, like a wire stretched too thin. After they left, I sat in my living room, the papers on my lap, the house too quiet. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, each second louder than the last. I poured a glass of red wine, the cheap kind George and I used to share, and started reading. The words blurred at first, legal jargon I didn't fully grasp, but by the second page it was clear. They weren't nothing. They were a transfer of deed, my house, my sanctuary, to Daniel and Claire. No mention of me staying, no protections, no conditions, just my signature, handing over everything. My hands shook, spilling wine on my blouse, a red stain spreading like blood. My home, worth nearly $800,000 in Maplewood's hot market, was theirs for the taking, and they'd planned it, together. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat in my armchair, the one George used to read his detective novels in, its leather worn soft by years of his touch. The walls, papered with a faded rose pattern we'd hung ourselves, seemed to close in. I saw Claire's smirk again, that glint of victory, and worse, Daniel's silence. My own son complicit. I wasn't just losing my home, I was losing the family I'd poured my life into. Tears burned my eyes, but I blinked them back. Crying wouldn't fix this. I thought of my mother, a woman who'd raised 4 kids alone after my father left, never once bowing to despair. "Evelyn," she'd say, "you're tougher than you know." I clung to that, a lifeline in the dark. By dawn something else stirred in me, a spark of defiance, small but fierce. I wasn't signing anything, not yet. I'd worked too hard, loved too fiercely to let them take everything without a fight. I didn't know how I'd stop them, but I knew I'd try. Claire's smirk had lit a fire, and Daniel's betrayal had fanned it. They thought I was old, weak, easy to push aside. They were wrong. The morning after Claire's smirk and Daniel's silence, I woke with a headache that felt like a hammer on my skull. The papers still sat on my coffee table, their edges curling slightly, like they were mocking me. I brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint, the kind George used to tease me about, and stared out my kitchen window at the oak tree in the backyard. Its branches swayed in the early breeze, steady and unbending, reminding me I needed to be the same. I wasn't ready to confront Daniel and Claire, not yet. I needed answers, and I needed a plan. My heart was still raw from their betrayal, but that spark of defiance from last night hadn't faded. If anything, it was growing. I called Margaret, my friend of 30 years, who'd seen me through George's death and every scraped knee of Daniel's childhood. She was a retired paralegal, sharp as a tack, with a nose for trouble and a laugh that could fill a room. "Evie," she said when I answered, her voice crackling through the phone, "what's got you sounding like you're ready to burn the house down?" I spilled everything: the dinner, Claire's smug, "just sign here," the deed transfer, Daniel's refusal to look at me. My voice broke when I got to that part, and Margaret didn't interrupt, just let me talk until I ran out of steam. "Honey," she finally said, "this smells like a setup. You need a lawyer, and you need one yesterday." She recommended Paul Whitaker, a no-nonsense attorney who'd helped her lock down her own estate when her kids started circling like vultures. I trusted Margaret like I trusted my own gut, so I booked an appointment with Paul for the next day, my hands still trembling, not from fear now, but from purpose. Paul's office was a cramped room above a bakery on Main Street, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread. He was in his 60s, with a bald head and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. I liked him immediately. He didn't talk down to me, or act like I was some doddering old lady. I handed him the papers, and he adjusted his glasses, scanning the pages with a frown that deepened with every line. "Evelyn," he said, leaning back in his creaky chair, "this is a deed transfer, plain and simple. If you sign, the house is theirs, no strings attached. You'd have no legal right to stay, no claim to anything." My stomach twisted, a cold knot forming. Why would they do this? I asked, though deep down I already suspected. Paul's eyes softened, but his voice was blunt. "Greed, usually, or control, sometimes both. People don't pull this on family unless they're after something big." He asked if I'd confronted them. I shook my head. I wanted to know the full picture before I showed my hand. When I got home, I couldn't sit still. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath. I wandered from room to room, touching the things that grounded me: the chipped ceramic mug Daniel made in 5th grade, the quilt my mother sewed, the scuff mark on the floor from when George dropped a wrench fixing the sink. Every corner held a memory, and the thought of losing it made my chest ache. But I wasn't just going to wallow. Margaret had taught me how to check property records online, a trick she'd picked up during her paralegal days. I sat at my ancient desktop, the fan whirring like a lawnmower, and pulled up my property details. My house, modest as it was with its peeling paint and creaky stairs, sat on a half-acre lot in Maplewood, where developers were snatching up land for condos and strip malls. Zillow estimated its value at $792,000. My throat tightened. This wasn't just about my home, it was about a paycheck, a windfall Claire and maybe even Daniel thought they could cash in on. That evening I called Daniel over, alone. Claire was at some charity gala, probably posting selfies to show off her generosity. He showed up looking tired, his tie loosened, his eyes avoiding mine. We sat in the living room, the grandfather clock ticking louder than ever. "What's going on with these papers, Danny?" I asked, using the nickname from when he was small, hoping it had reached the boy I raised. He shifted on the couch, picking at a loose thread. "It's just to make things easier, Mom. For the future, you know, estate stuff." His voice was flat, like he was reading a script. I pressed, keeping my tone soft but firm. "Why's Claire so insistent? What's the rush?" He mumbled something about investments and security, but his words sounded rehearsed, like Claire had coached him. My heart sank deeper, not just for the house, but for the son who couldn't look me in the eye. I wanted to shake him, to demand where my boy had gone, but I held back. "I'll think about it," I said, and he nodded, relieved, like he'd dodged something. After he left, I stood at the sink, washing dishes by hand to keep my hands busy. The water was too hot, stinging my skin, but I didn't care. I kept seeing Claire's smirk, hearing Daniel's weak excuses. They thought I was soft, an old woman who'd roll over because I loved my son, but love doesn't mean blindness. I'd raised Daniel to respect family, to value what we'd built together, and he'd let Claire twist that. The betrayal cut deeper than I could say, but it also sharpened my resolve. I dried my hands, picked up the phone and called Paul again. I want to protect what's mine, I told him, whatever it takes. His voice was steady on the other end. Good, let's get to work. The days after my talk with Daniel felt like walking through fog, everything familiar but blurred by hurt. I kept replaying his mumbled excuses, the way he couldn't meet my eyes, and Claire's smirk, sharp as a blade. My house, my sanctuary, was at the heart of their plan, and I was just a hurdle to clear. I'd faced plenty: George's death, lean years when the bills barely got paid, but this betrayal from my own son cut deepest. Still, that spark of defiance I'd felt was growing into a steady flame. I wasn't going to let them take my home or my dignity, not without a fight. Paul Whitaker, my lawyer, became my lifeline. I met him again at his office above the bakery, the smell of cinnamon rolls drifting through the cracked window. He'd already reviewed the deed transfer papers Claire had pushed on me, and now he leaned forward, his glasses glinting in the morning light. Evelyn, you've got assets, your house, your savings, your pension. We can protect them, but we need to move fast. He suggested a revocable living trust, a legal tool that would let me control my estate even if I was pressured to sign anything. I could name beneficiaries, decide who'd get what, and ensure I'd stay in my home until I was ready to leave. The idea hit me like a gulp of strong coffee, practical, powerful, mine. Let's do it, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Over the next week, we met twice more, hammering out details. Paul's office was a mess of files and coffee mugs, but his mind was sharp, cutting through my fears with clear steps. You can name anyone as beneficiaries, he said. Family, friends, charities, doesn't have to be Daniel or Claire. That stopped me cold. I'd always assumed Daniel would inherit everything, my home, my modest savings, the life I'd built, but now, the thought of my estate going to a women's shelter, or the library where I'd worked for decades, felt right, like a way to honor what mattered to me. What about a letter? I asked. Something to explain why I'm doing this. Paul nodded, a glint of approval in his eyes. Smart. It'll make your intentions crystal clear, and it'll hit harder than any argument. We crafted the trust with care. My house, valued at nearly $800,000, would stay mine to live in for life. After that, it'd go to the Maplewood Women's Shelter, a place I'd volunteered at years ago, helping women rebuild after their own betrayals. My savings would fund a literacy program at the library, named after my mother, who'd taught me to love books. And the letter, it was my voice, my truth, explaining why I'd cut Daniel and Claire out, not out of spite, but because they'd tried to strip me of what I'd earned. Paul added a twist. We'd keep the trust secret until the right moment, letting Claire think she was winning. They're banking on you being too trusting, he said, pushing his glasses up. Let's use that. Back home, I started noticing things I'd missed. Claire's visits ramped up, each one laced with comments about my house's potential. She'd glide through my kitchen, her heels clicking on the linoleum, saying things like, "This place could be stunning with a modern layout." Developers would pay top dollar. Her eyes lingered on the backyard, where the oak tree stood proud. I smiled and nodded, playing the part of the clueless old lady, but inside I was cataloging every word. Daniel, when he came with her, was quieter, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying a weight. I wanted to believe he was just caught in Claire's web, but his silence at that first dinner still stung. He was complicit, and that truth was a splinter I couldn't pull out. Claire's pressure didn't stop at visits. She started texting, her messages cloaked in fake concern. "Evelyn, have you signed yet? We just want to protect you." Protect me, my foot. I'd seen the property records. I knew what my half-acre lot was worth in Maplewood's booming market. Each text made my jaw tighten, but I kept my replies vague. "Still thinking it over, dear." Her responses grew sharper, less patient, like she was annoyed I wasn't folding fast enough. I saved every message, printing them out on my clunky printer, and tucking them into a folder for Paul. Evidence, I told myself, just in case. One night, alone in my living room, I sat with that folder, the grandfather clock ticking like a heartbeat. I pulled out Daniel's old baseball trophies from the shelf, their brass dulled by time. He'd been so proud at 12, grinning ear to ear when he won MVP. Where was that boy now? I wanted to call him, to demand answers, but Paul's advice echoed, "Don't tip your hand." So I waited, letting Claire think she had the upper hand. Signing Paul's trust was my rebellion, quiet but fierce. I did it on a Tuesday morning, my signature steady on the dotted line, the pen heavy in my hand. It wasn't just about protecting my assets, it was about reclaiming my power. By the week's end, I felt lighter, like I'd shed a layer of fear. Claire could smirk, Daniel could dodge, but I had a plan now. The trust was my shield, the letter my sword. I didn't know when I'd reveal them, but I knew it'd be soon. Claire thought she was playing me, but I was ready to turn the tables, and when I did, I'd make sure she saw the woman she'd underestimated, a woman who'd built a life, a home and a legacy, and wasn't about to let anyone steal it. The trust was signed, locked away in Paul's safe, but the weight of what I'd done didn't hit me until I was back in my house, alone with my thoughts. I'd never imagined I'd be guarding my home from my own son and his wife. Claire's smirk still burned in my mind, and Daniel's silence was a wound that wouldn't close. But I wasn't the same woman who'd sat stunned at that first dinner, papers in hand. I had a plan now, a shield forged in secret, and I was ready to use it. I just needed the right moment to show Claire and Daniel that I wasn't the pushover they thought. I decided that moment would be another dinner. I called Claire, keeping my voice light, and said I was ready to discuss the papers. She jumped at the chance, her tone dripping with that fake sweetness I'd come to hate. "Oh, Evelyn, that's wonderful. We'll be there Friday." Daniel barely spoke on the call, just a mumbled "see you then." I hung up, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with something closer to resolve. This wasn't about revenge, not really, it was about respect, mine for myself, and the life I'd built in this house on Elm Street. Friday came, and I spent the day preparing. I roasted a chicken, Daniel's favorite since he was a boy, and set the oak table with my blue floral plates. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, counting down to the moment I'd been planning for weeks. I wore my best cardigan, the green one George always said brought out my eyes, and tucked Paul's trust documents into a folder by my chair. The letter, my explanation of why I'd cut them out, was folded inside, its words heavy with truth. I wasn't nervous, not anymore. I was ready. Claire and Daniel arrived at 6, the evening light casting long shadows through my windows. Claire swept in, wearing a tailored blazer, her heels clicking like she owned the place. Her smirk was back, bolder now, like she thought victory was hers. Daniel looked worn, his tie askew, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Smells amazing, Mom," he said, but his voice was hollow, like he was going through the motions. We sat, and I served the food, letting Claire fill the silence with chatter about renovations and market trends. She talked about open-plan kitchens and granite counters, as if my home was already hers to gut. I nodded, smiling, while my hand rested on the folder by my side. Dessert was apple pie, warm from the oven. As I cut slices, I slid Claire's deed transfer papers back across the table, unsigned. Her fork paused mid-air, her eyes narrowing. "Evelyn, I thought you were ready to sign," she said, her voice tight, the smirk faltering. I leaned back, meeting her gaze. "Claire, I know what you're doing. This house is worth nearly $800,000, and you want it for yourself." The room went still, the clocks ticking louder than ever. Claire's face froze, her lips parting but no words coming. Daniel sputtered, "Mom, that's not," but I raised a hand, silencing him. I pulled out Paul's trust and the letter, laying them on the table like a winning hand. "I've set up a living trust," I said, my voice calm but firm. "My house, my savings, none of it goes to you. The house will go to the Maplewood Women's Shelter when I'm gone. My savings will fund a library program, and this letter explains why." I opened it, my hands steady, and read aloud. "To whom it may concern, I, Evelyn Marie Thompson, have chosen to protect my estate from those who sought to take it through deceit. My son Daniel and his wife Claire attempted to transfer my home without my informed consent, prioritizing their gain over my security. This trust ensures my legacy supports those who value respect and dignity, as I always have. My voice broke only once, on Daniel's name. Claire's face cycled through shock, anger, then a flushed red. Daniel stared at his plate, his hands gripping the table's edge, tears glistening in his eyes. I didn't stop. You thought I wouldn't notice, Claire. You thought I was too old, too trusting, but I see you. And Daniel, I turned to him, my throat tight. You let her do this. You broke my heart. The words hung heavy, filling the silence. Claire recovered first, her voice sharp. This is ridiculous, Evelyn. We were trying to help you. You're twisting everything. She pushed her chair back, standing, but I didn't flinch. Help me, I said, almost laughing. You wanted my house for a quick sale. I've seen the property records, Claire. I know what this lot's worth. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her arguments crumbling. Daniel finally looked up, his voice small. Mom, I didn't mean, I thought it was for the best, but his words fell flat, too late to mend what was broken. I stood, gathering the trust and letter. You chose Danny, both of you, now live with it. Claire grabbed her purse, storming out, her heels echoing down the hall. Daniel lingered, his eyes pleading, but I shook my head. Go, I said softer now. He did, the door clicking shut behind him. Alone, I sank into my chair, the pie untouched. The house felt quiet, but not empty. I'd faced them, laid my truth bare, and held my ground. My heart ached for Daniel, for the boy he'd been, but I'd done what I had to. The trust was my shield, the letter my voice. Claire's smirk was gone, and I'd taken back my power. For the first time in weeks, I felt like Evelyn again, fierce, independent, unbroken. The silence after that dinner was deafening. Claire's heels had clicked out of my life, and Daniel's quiet exit left a hollow ache in my chest. I'd faced plenty of losses, George's death, the slow fade of old friends, but nothing prepared me for the sting of my son's betrayal. My house on Elm Street, with its creaky floors and rose-patterned wallpaper, stood as steady as ever, but I felt different. Lighter, somehow like I'd shed a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. I'd faced Claire's smirk and Daniel's complicity head-on, and with Paul's trust and that letter, I'd taken back my power. But the victory wasn't sweet. It was bittersweet, tinged with the grief of what I'd lost. Not just my son, but the idea of the family I thought we were. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. Claire stopped texting, her fake concern replaced by a cold void. I didn't hear from Daniel either, not at first. I kept busy, tending my garden, where the green beans were still thriving despite the early chill. I'd kneel in the dirt, my hands working the soil, and think about my mother, who'd faced her own battles with nothing but grit and a stubborn heart. She'd have been proud of me, I thought, for standing my ground. But late at night, when the grandfather clock ticked in the dark, I'd see Daniel's face, his tears at the dinner table, his weak "I didn't mean," and wonder if I'd been too hard, too final. Then I'd remember Claire's smirk, the deed transfer, and my resolve would harden again. Love doesn't mean letting people walk over you, not even your own son. About a month later, a letter arrived, tucked in my mailbox with Daniel's familiar scrawl. I stood in the kitchen, holding it, my heart thudding. Part of me wanted to tear it open, part of me wanted to burn it. I set it on the counter and made tea instead, letting it sit there for a day, like a guest I wasn't ready to face. When I finally opened it, the words were simple, raw. "Mom, I'm sorry," he wrote. "I let Claire convince me it was for your own good. I was wrong. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. No excuses, no deflections, just regret." I read it 3 times, my eyes blurring, and then folded it away. I wasn't ready to respond, not yet. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend overnight, and I needed time to sort through the tangle of hurt and hope. I threw myself into new routines to fill the quiet. I started volunteering at the Maplewood Women's Shelter, the one I'd named in my trust. It wasn't far, just a 10-minute drive, and I'd spend mornings sorting donations or listening to women share their stories. Women who'd faced their own betrayals, from husbands, families, systems. Their strength fed mine, reminding me why I'd chosen to protect my legacy for them. One afternoon, a woman named Rosa, barely 30 but with eyes older than mine, told me how she'd left an abusive husband with nothing but her kids and a suitcase. You're brave, I told her, and she smiled, shy but proud. So are you, she said, and I realized she was right. Bravery wasn't just for the young. Margaret became my anchor too. She'd come over with a bottle of cheap red wine like we used to drink in our book club days, and we'd sit on my porch, laughing about nothing and everything. You showed 'em, Evie, she'd say, raising her glass. Not many would have had the guts. Her faith in me patched some of the cracks in my heart. One evening, she suggested I visit the library to talk about the literacy program I'd funded in my trust. I went the next day, meeting with the head librarian, a kind woman named Susan who'd worked with me years ago. We planned a reading program for kids, named after my mother, and as we talked, I felt a spark of purpose I hadn't known I'd lost. My legacy wasn't just my house, it was the good I could do, the mark I could leave. Daniel's letter stayed in my desk drawer, a quiet presence. I didn't write back, but I didn't throw it away either. I'd left a door open in the trust, a clause Paul had suggested. If Daniel proved himself, showed real change, I could revise the beneficiaries, not for Claire, never for her, but for my son maybe someday. It would take work, not just words. He'd have to earn my trust again, the way I'd earned my independence over decades of hard choices and harder days. By winter, my house felt like mine again. I'd repainted the kitchen, a soft yellow that caught the morning light, and hung new curtains I'd sewn myself. The oak tree in the backyard stood tall, its tire swing swaying in the breeze. I'd sit in George's old armchair, a book in my lap, and feel the weight of my 72 years, not as a burden, but as strength. Claire's smirk had faded to a memory, and Daniel's silence was a wound I was learning to live with. I'd learned something through all this. Respect isn't owed, even to family. It's earned, fought for, held tight, and independence, that's mine, no signature required. As I watched the first snow dust my garden, I felt a quiet pride. I'd faced betrayal and come out whole, not because I was perfect, but because I was Evelyn, stubborn, fierce, and still here. The trust was my shield, the shelter and library my legacy, and if Daniel ever came back, ready to rebuild, I'd be here too, but on my terms, in my home, with my heart intact.